Josh Paul, State Department official, has resigned over arms transfer to Israel. Josh Paul spent more than 11 years as the director of congressional and public affairs at the Bureau that oversees arm transfers to foreign nations. The New York Times reports a State Department official in the Bureau that oversees arms transfers resigned this week in protest of the Biden administration's decision to continue sending weapons and ammunition to Israel as it lays siege to Gaza in its war with Hamas. In his resignation letter, Josh Paul, who has been the director of congressional and public affairs for the State Department's Bureau of Political Military Affairs for over 11 years, said the Biden administration's, quote, blind support for one side was leading to policy decisions that were, quote, short-sighted, destructive, unjust, and contradictory to the very values we publicly espouse. Good on this guy. The response Israel is taking, and with it, the American support, both for that response and for the status quo of the occupation, will only lead to more and deeper suffering for both Israeli and Palestinian people. That's a key point. It is not just support for the Israeli response. It is support for the status quo of the occupation, because all the talk out of the government is that the Palestinian people deserve the right to self-determination. They deserve to live in peace and security, as if they were living in peace and security until October 7th, right? That's the level of propaganda that we're dealing with. So it's good that he called that out as well. He added, I fear we are repeating the same mistakes that we have made these past decades, and I decline to be part of it for longer. In an interview, Mr. Paul said that Israel's cutting off of water, food, medical care, and electricity to the Gaza Strip, a region of 2 million people, should prompt protections in a number of long-standing federal laws intended to keep American weapons out of the hands of human rights violators. But those legal guardrails are failing, he said. The problem with all of these provisions is that it rests on the executive branch making a determination that human rights violations have occurred, Mr. Paul said. Exactly. The decision to make a determination doesn't rest with some nonpartisan academic entity, and there's no incentive for the president to actually determine anything. I want to repeat that. There's no incentive for the president to actually determine anything. There's no incentive for Joe Biden to press Netanyahu on the hospital bombing. There's no incentive for Joe Biden to call out the white phosphorus. There's no incentive for him to do that. The United States sees no incentive to actually blow the whistle on war crimes. Right. There's nothing in it for them. Joe Biden's on record. Joe Biden said years ago when he was first elected to the Senate, if Israel didn't exist, we would have to invent it. Israel is our proxy in the region, which means there is a conflict of interest here, obviously. I'm not saying anything anybody doesn't know, but the average schmuck watching TV, watching Anthony Blinken at the podium, watching Joe Biden at the podium, they don't know this. There is no incentive for them to tell the truth about this, to call Israel out about this. Right. And that's why he is stepping down. Because it's not enough to say, well, we expect them to act in accordance with international law. If there's no incentive to call them out for violating international law, then you're not going to do it. And there's no one there to stop them from doing it. They're the executive branch. Certainly what? The fucking House Republicans are going to impeach him over this? No, they're all in Israel's pocket as well. There's no one home here. There's no one here to fix this. That's the real tragedy of this, is that there's no one around to make this right. Mr. Paul, whose resignation was reported earlier by HuffPost, said that he had seen the U.S. government approve numerous sales or shipments of material to other Middle Eastern countries, even when he believed federal law should have prevented them from going forward. On all of them, there's a moment where you can say, okay, well, you know, it's out of my hands, but I know Congress is going to push back, he said, by issuing a hold on the transfer of grilling officials in hearings at the Capitol. But in this instance, there isn't any significant pushback likely from Congress. That's what I just said. There isn't any other oversight mechanism. There isn't any other forum for debate. And that's part of what got into my decision making. Exactly. The only way for him to start a debate is to do this and try to get as much press out of it as possible. I'm surprised this got as much coverage as it did, to be honest with you. Continuing to give Israel what he described as carte blanche to kill a generation of enemies only to create a new one does not ultimately serve the United States interests, Mr. Paul said. Last slide on this story. What it leads to is this desire to sort of impose security at any cost, including in cost to the Palestinian civilian population, he said, and that doesn't ultimately lead to security. This administration, I think, knows better and understands some of the complexity, but brought very little of that nuance to the policy decisions that are being made. Since posting his resignation letter online Wednesday, Mr. Paul said he had received an outpouring of support from State Department colleagues and congressional staff members, so he's not alone. A lot of people are wrestling with this being the current policy and are finding it to be deeply problematic, he said. I've really been quite moved by some of the folks who have reached out to say that they understand where I'm coming from. They respect my decision. It's been very supportive. So I mentioned the HuffPost initially broke that he resigned, but the HuffPost has been on this for about a week now. So this came out a few days back. On thin ice, some Biden admin staffers feel stifled discussing horrors in Gaza. There's a lot to read here. We won't read all of it. But what this article essentially outlines is the hypocrisy of Joe Biden touting the diversity of his cabinet, the diversity of his decision-making teams, while allowing no ideological diversity at all when it comes to this issue. So this was an article detailing some of the rumblings at the Department of State. And then after this, the follow-up to that article was mutiny brewing inside State Department over Israel-Palestine policy. Morale is low, and some staffers are preparing to formally express their opposition to President Joe Biden's approach, officials told HuffPost. Obviously, this was when Josh Paul announced that he was quitting. Two officials told HuffPost that diplomats are preparing what's called a dissent cable, a document criticizing American policy that goes to the agency's leaders through a protected internal channel. Such cables are seen within the State Department as consequential statements of serious disagreement at key historical moments. The dissent channel was established amid deep internal conflict during the Vietnam War, and diplomats have since then used it to warn that the U.S. is making dangerous and self-defeating choices abroad. The cable would come in the wake of Josh Paul, the aforementioned Josh Paul, a veteran State Department official announcing his resignation on Wednesday. After more than a decade of working on arms deals, he said he could not morally support the U.S.'s moves to supply Israel's war effort. So Russell talks about, rightly so, how they're not able to control the narrative here. They're not even able to control the narrative within their own shop. As you see, everyone, it seems, but Blinken himself, whoever this fucking Uzra Zeya, whatever the hell her name was, who we just watched a few minutes back, the real higher-ups, the real top brass are all in lockstep. But they're having a hard time even controlling their underlings, because this is what happens when you commit the greatest massacre in a generation. This is what happens when you enable and fund and support a world historic human atrocity. Even your own house becomes unruly at that point. And that ought to tell us, look, it's great that these guys did this. It's great that Josh Paul did this, but that ought to tell you how severe this is, because these are lifers. These are lifers. Right. They would not be walking out unless they understood how dire this was, and unless they said, you know what, I'm never going to be able to sleep at night again if I don't get out of here, if I don't speak up and do something. And in this case, they left, and he got as much press as he could out of it. I hope he gets more press. That's why we felt a strong need to cover this evening. And I hope the word gets out that even the foreign policy stooges are starting to rebel. That's how atrocious what is happening actually is.
Right. And the extended HuffPost article about the resignation got into how your favorite faceless man behind the throne, Jake Sullivan,
right?
His brother works at the State Department, and it got into how nobody wants to voice opposition because they're afraid he's going to go back to his brother and rat them out if they voice any opposition to the policy. It was also interesting because they had some of what he put on LinkedIn. The guy who resigned, what's his name? Paul?
Josh Paul, yeah.
Josh Paul. And we, especially in our political lane, we're in opposition to people in these positions. A general rule of thumb that I have in life is that most people don't see themselves as villains. Even the most villainous people feel a need to justify their actions. They feel a need to see themselves as being on the side of the angels. And when you looked at his thought process, it was very humanizing in a way that I think a lot of people on the outside just we don't see these people that way. But his description of how he saw his job was essentially harm reduction.
Right. That's
like his description was kind of that, yes, the United States does these absolutely horrible things. And my deal with myself was essentially, he said, am I doing more good than harm? By being there, am I preventing worse things from happening? So that was fascinating to me. His baseline was that our policies are horrible. And his job was to try to talk them out of giving weapons to murderous regimes with horrific human rights violations insofar as he could manage to do that. And his resignation, his logic for this resignation was that he had no avenue to make it better. So the deal he had made with himself, he would have to break it if he continued to work there, because he could not do any harm reduction in this situation. That was a very interesting insight into the fact that, look, what, you think these people at the State Department are walking around going, yeah.
Right.
They believe they're doing the right thing. And I'm sure there are a lot of people like him who recognize that American foreign policy is horrific and murderous and see themselves as trying to ameliorate that reality. Most of them just don't speak out like this.
Right. Because most of them just go along to get along until it's too late, until they're at the top. And then once you're at the top, it requires a lot of courage. And, this is where you get the real psychos at the top. That's why people who rise to the level of Antony Blinken are such psychopaths. Because only the psychopaths can actually stick around long enough and eat enough shit to get to the top. Only the people who have no soul whatsoever, no morality whatsoever, get to the top. Now, of course, a thing like this doesn't happen every 2 years, right? So this is an extreme example. But if you look at what our foreign policy has been in the region, it's been atrocious. It's been absolutely atrocious. That's why Hillary Clinton gets to be Secretary of State, because Hillary Clinton would poison her grandmother for $1, right? John Kerry, same thing. Rex Tillerson, oil guy. Everybody who rises to that level is someone who's willing to do just about anything to rise to that level. The system filters out the people like Josh Paul. That's why Josh Paul will never be Secretary of State, because he doesn't stick around long enough to get there, because he has too much of a conscience up here.
Please clap.